I have to admit that until I started really studying this book, I did not realize what a gem it is. And by the time we get to the end, to chapter 10, we may have started to realize that there is a common theme running through the pages of this just incredible little book. The theme of God's grace, and specifically how God himself brings about restoring people into a relationship with himself. We started with the exiles who had sinned against God, and they'd been carried off into Babylon. And we got the promise of Jeremiah, who told them, despite them being a people who had rejected and turned away from God, God had a plan and a purpose for them that would restore them. That was grace. See, then we heard about King Cyrus. He was the most powerful man in the world, and he's been stirred by God to let the people leave their captivity, enabling them to return to Jerusalem to be a restored people. That was grace as well. Then we heard about the destruction of the temple, and that had resulted in all the gold artifacts being stolen and the temple destroyed. And God ensured that the artifacts were kept safe until it was time for them to return. And so when they returned to rebuild the temple, they would be able to go with all these things and also financial funds provided by their current captors to restore what had been stolen. That was grace. And then when the people stopped working on the temple, when they had taken the materials for the temple and used them in their own homes instead, God raised up 2 prophets to get them working again and to restore their motivation in their calling. That was grace again. And when the nation had fallen into sin and intermarried with those outside of the Jewish community, God raised up Ezra to come and to restore their relationship with him, rather than bringing judgment upon them for what they'd done. And you know what? That was grace as well too. See, Ezra is a book full of grace from the start all the way through to the end. And it's at the end where we find ourselves now, at the time when Ezra has arrived in Jerusalem and unearthed a problem with the people that was so severe that Ezra believes that God could and would be justified in bringing discipline and perhaps even destruction upon the Jews again. Ezra is more than aware that there is a need for God's grace to be revealed once more. And last time we ended with the nation in a predicament, and Ezra 10 follows on immediately afterwards with perhaps just a breath in between the chapters. Despite the grace of God, despite the faithfulness of God, despite the goodness of God, the nation has fallen into sin, and God, through the teaching of the scriptures, has pointed this out to them. And I guess we've all met people who we consider to be pointers. They're the people who are eager to point out your mistakes, point out when you've messed up, point out when you've failed at something. They're the type of people that even after months or even years, they will still be saying, do you remember when you did that? Or do you remember when that happened? Or did you really do that? Knowing full well that you did. And there are people in this world who have a view that God is a pointer. That God has this long memory of your mistakes and your errors and your mess-ups. And when you do something wrong, he remembers about it for a rainy day, and then he holds it against you. That God is just some sort of big policeman in the sky who wants to limit your fun and restrict your life. But you know what? There is an element certainly, of truth in that. See, God is a pointer. The issue is that the concept of the pointing of God is where most people only get to. They think that the pointing of God is just God telling them that they can't do something, or they shouldn't do something, or they shouldn't have done that. That God in some way wants to restrict them and to stop them from having an enjoyable time. But the thing is, God will point out your sin. It's called conviction. But when he does that, it is with purpose. God points in order to stir you to do something about it, because living in a state of sin is never good. That's what God's grace is to you about. Make no mistake about that. God's pointing is wrapped in grace. And at the time of Ezra, God could easily have left the people to their own devices. God did not have to interfere. He could have left them to merely get on their merry way. They had their temple, they had their lives, they were living in the land. They were, in a fashion, to a degree at least, worshipping God, perhaps just turning up on a Sabbath and singing a few psalms. But they were living in sin. They were living unfaithfully towards God. Would God have been operating in grace towards them had he not pointed out their unfaithfulness and gave them an opportunity to change? Years ago, just after Alison, my wife, and I were married, we moved into our first house. And there was an old gas fire that looked like it was there from like an original feature of the lounge. And as we headed into winter, we began to use it more frequently. And it was because we were being used more frequently, we decided to get it serviced. And we found out that the gas fire was not fit to be used. And the chap who came to service it was so dismayed at it, he covered it from head to toe with stickers saying it was condemned. It was a danger to us. It should not be turned back on under any circumstances, and it needed to be replaced immediately. We did not know there was a problem with it. Had we not got it serviced, it could well have caused us a problem, and a serious problem at that. But having that pointed out to us meant that we did something about it. We didn't ignore the pointing, we changed it. See, the truth is, what you don't know can hurt you. It seems to me that the people didn't even know that there was a problem with their behavior until God points it out to them. See, God could have left them in their unknowingness, but their guilt, even though they did not know any different, would still have remained. And at some point, that gas fire has gone boom. God, in his grace, was pointing this out to them so they could respond before that happened. And God's pointing is always to highlight a problem so that a correct response can be made. That's grace. Some will respond to that, others will turn away from it. Remember Jonah? He's on the boat, he's on his way to Joppa, heading in the wrong direction. He's been told by God to go and do something, and he does the opposite. He's unfaithful to what God has asked. He's rejected God. He's turned away from God. And God points. See, there's this big storm, and he's on the boat, and he realizes that he's the reason for the storm, that God has uncovered what he's done. And so he jumps overboard into the middle of the sea. He's been unfaithful to God. He's disregarded what God has said. He's ignored his word. He's entered into rebellion. And what God could have done was to bring judgment upon him for his disobedience. Maybe some sort of lightning in the storm directed at the place where Jonah stood. But instead of that, God uses the storm not to judge, but to point. Because God was always looking for a response. God is looking to exercise grace before judgment. And just before chapter 10 starts, Ezra, he spent time confessing the sins of the people before God. He's held nothing back in what he's brought before the people. And this scene is looking a little bit crazy. At first, it's just Ezra who's in a bad way. The silence, the clothes have been ripped. He's pulled clumps of hair from his head and from his beard, followed by one of the most powerful prayers in the Old Testament. And as he's been pouring out his confession on behalf of the people to God, people have started to gather. Here's Ezra, and he's creating a bit of commotion. He's throwing himself down onto the floor before God in the shadow of the temple, and people are gathering to see what's happening. And long before, this huge crowd is gathering, and they're hearing some of what Ezra has been saying, and they're getting their heads around that this is not a good thing. Ezra pulls no punches in how he's described the behavior of the Jews. He says, our iniquities have risen above our heads, and our guilt has even gone to heaven. He says, this day we have been in great guilt on account of our iniquity. We have forsaken your commandments. He talks about our evil deeds, or he says, we who commit abominations, we have been unfaithful, the unfaithfulness of the exiles. We have transgressed greatly in this matter. See, the pointing of God has brought Ezra to his knees, and with him, a huge crowd has now gathered. And they are now making themselves weeping bitterly in front of them for their actions. And this chap called Shekinah, he comes to Ezra, and he must have had an idea of what was going on. And you can almost see him trying to pull Ezra back into the present. He tells him to make a covenant with God. He says, we need to act correctly. We need to sort ourselves out. It's time to move on from seeking God's forgiveness to entering back into relationship. And then he says these words to Ezra, rise up. This matter is in your hands. See, in the face of the problem, in the face of the unfaithfulness of the Jews, in the face of God pointing out their sin and then being on the verge of being destroyed, God had poured out his grace upon the Jews and has appointed Ezra to be the answer to the problem. Rise up. This matter is in your hands, Ezra. You have the answer. And this is the moment that the whole of Ezra has been building up to, that's been woven throughout the verses that we've covered, that's been revealed carefully through the accounts that Ezra has retold, that God does not just point, God always goes further. God also appoints. Where God points something out, God also appoints. He appoints a path, a route, an answer in response. A great example of this was in Ezra 5, when the people were getting on with their own lives, using the temple materials for their own homes and ignoring the rebuilding work. And God uses two prophets, but primarily Haggai, to point out their situation to them, to point out their unfaithfulness. And then once they respond and restart the work, God appoints the governor of the area, Tattenai, to make a way for the temple to be rebuilt. More materials to be provided. See, God's pointing and then appointing. That's grace. The way that God worked all these things out, and we covered that recently if you were here at Refresh a few weeks ago, and how all that came to happen, that could only have been manufactured by God. It's grace. For Jonah, who we left in the sea just a few moments ago, some distance from land and undoubtedly going to drown, God follows his pointing of him by appointing a large fish to come and swallow him and take him to the safety of dry ground. See, that's grace. That's God's appointing. See, when we get hung up about God's pointing, when all we see is God saying, don't do that, that's not good, you've done something wrong. It would have been better to have done it this way instead. Then when all we see is that, we firstly miss out on that God is moving in grace with us. And we never get to the part where God appoints a way for us to move on. To the Jews who had been unfaithful to God, who have had their sin pointed out, God has appointed a position of leadership, responsibility, and authority upon Ezra. That means whatever he says needs to be responded to. That was a move of God. That was God's grace to the people. He has the full weight of the king backing him to make whatever changes is necessary to resolve the problem that God has pointed out. He has the knowledge of the scriptures in order to ensure that they respond correctly in God's sight, because the changes that they were going to make were going to be difficult, and only someone of Ezra's position and background will be able to see that through. See, when God appoints, he appoints something specifically and relevantly and personally. It was no good in the face of the current situation for God to appoint something that wasn't relevant. They didn't need something that wasn't relevant. They needed something that could meet the need. And in Ezra, they found God's appointing. And through that appointing, they found reconciliation with God. And we read this, then all the assembly replied in a loud voice, and they're talking to Ezra. That's right, what you have said. So our duty is to do, for we have transgressed greatly in this matter. Let our leader represent the whole assembly, and let all those in our cities who have married foreign wives come to appointed times together with the elders and the judges in the city, until the fierce anger of our God on account of this matter is turned away. So the exiles did so. See, God appointed Ezra. The people listened, they responded, and the anger of God is turned away, and the people are reconciled once more. But you know, for all of Ezra's good points, and you might have noticed that I'm a big fan of Ezra. I think he is a real hidden hero of the Bible. Someone who was called by God, who responded to God, who studied the Word of God, a man of consistency, who shunned compromise, who was not afraid to step out and stand up for what was right. Man of prayer and intercession who carried credibility and the respect of people both then and throughout the last 2,500 years. And you know what? I hope that over the last few months, as we've studied and worked our way through this book, you've grown in your appreciation for him too. But for all his good points, he was only ever going to be a temporary fix for a certain time and for a certain place. See, after Ezra, the nation would fall into sin again. And Ezra, he was not a permanent appointment by God. See, the underlying issue of the people was that their sinful and rebellious hearts. Their hearts needed to be changed, not just their actions and their wayward decisions. And so Ezra could only go so far. The ultimate pointing of God relates to the hearts of the people that fed into their actions. Ezra, for all his good, he was not able to permanently change the hearts of the people. See, the law which they had broken was only put in place by God to let everyone know that it could not be kept. The sinful state of their hearts was the heart of the problem. The law was God's way of pointing out the people's sin so they could recognize it for themselves. Whilst God had appointed a temporary way for the people to respond to their sin, which was through the ongoing and regular sacrifices, they were only ever going to, like Ezra, point to a permanent appointing that God would make that could change hearts rather than just wayward actions. That appointing would not be for a specific time or for a certain incident. It would be forever and would encompass everything. But for that, God appointed himself. And he would do that for us is the ultimate example of grace for us. See, the book of Ezra and Ezra himself points us to a time when a man would arise in Judea to deal with the unfaithfulness of the people. A man who, like Ezra, wept under the shadow of the temple for and over the people. But one who was not appointed to tell the people what to do, but one who by his appointment would permanently change the hearts of those who respond to him so their relationship with God could be permanently restored. See, this amazing book, even today, points you and I to Jesus. What we do with that and how we respond to him will either be God's pointing or God's appointing.
Let the King of my heart be the mountain where I run, the fountain I drink from. Oh, he is my song. Let the King of my heart be the shadow where I hide, the ransom for my life. Oh, he is my song. And let the King of my heart the wind inside my sails, the anchor in the waves. Oh, he is my song. Let the King of my heart be the fire inside my veins, the echo of my days. Oh, he is my song. You are good, you're good. You're so good to me, yeah. You're so good to me, yeah. Oh, come on, we sing. And you're never gonna let me down. You're never gonna let me. Come on, let faith rise, we sing. You're never gonna let me